serta pemudi jangan sangsi lagi. Nasib negeri tergantung pada dirimu sendiri.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the NUS Baba House. I'm Danielle, Assistant Manager from the Outreach team here, and thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us online, especially during this period when our talks aren't able to be on site. So today's talk is the third talk in the Dialects and Dialogues Language Speaker series. This series was devised to complement the discussions within the NUS Baba House's current exhibition, Glossaries of the Straits Chinese Homemaking, which touches upon identity formation among early settlers in colonial Singapore. The 4 talks in this series, happening over 4 weeks, address various linguistic and literary trends in Southeast Asia, Singapore, and within the Peranakan community. So this evening, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Nala Lee, who will take us into the field of linguistics with her work on language documentation of endangered languages such as Baba Malay. Traditionally, the home language of the Peranakans, Baba Malay is a contact language that can be contextualized within the broader field of language endangerment. So her talk will feature documentation research that is taking place in response to language endangerment, pointing out different potential trajectories of such research. Dr. Nala Lee is an assistant professor of linguistics at the National University of Singapore. She is interested in the spectrum of language change brought about by multilingualism. Specifically, her research interests include language endangerment, language death, and Creole studies. She wrote a grammar of Baba Malay for her PhD dissertation and is a co-developer of the Language Endangerment Index, which is used by the Catalogue of Endangered Languages. She has published in journals such as Language in Society, Journal of Pidgin and Creole Languages, Language Documentation and Conservation, and the Annual Review of Linguistics. I'll quickly pass the time over to Dr. Nala Lee now, who will begin her sharing.
All right, so thanks, Danielle. Let me know if you can't hear me. I think it should be working all right. So let me share my slides over here. Okay, see. All right, I hope this is working well. Thanks for being here with me this evening. Thanks for sacrificing some of your dinner time. So I hope this makes it, some of what I say would make it worth it. So I'd like to begin by running through how I've envisioned this talk to look like. So this list takes on no particular order, but generally speaks to the contents of this talk. So first, it makes sense to contextualize Baba Malay within the global trends of language endangerment. Then I'll talk about why it's necessary to care about languages being endangered. So what is there to lose? In other words, if you lose a language. I'll talk more specifically also about the endangerment of Baba Malay and say a little bit about what we stand to lose if we lose Baba Malay. I'll then discuss the importance of this new subfield that we call language documentation, and then talk about some of the work that has been done on the language and talk about the kind of work that I'm carrying out on the language in terms of dealing with modern Baba Malay as well as dealing with much earlier texts of the language. So at this point, it might be good to clarify that this talk focuses entirely on Baba Malay and its speakers. So those are the Chinese Peranakans in Singapore, not so much as well as those in Malaysia, mainly Malacca. Not so much in Penang because we know over there the Peranakans there speak Penang Hokkien with some lexicon from Baba Malay, of course, but they don't quite speak Baba Malay as spoken here. And we aren't really focused as well on the language of the Peranakans in Indonesia or the home languages of the other Jawi Peranakans, Chitis, and so on and so forth. So it's Chinese Peranakans and it's Baba Malay that we focus on in this talk. So let me figure out how to, okay, this works. All right, so let's begin with a few figures over here. Some of these figures are kind of scary, but it's necessary for a general overview of language endangerment. The notion that languages can and are already dying out is not a particularly new phenomenon. So we know that that's been happening to Latin for a while now, depending on whether you believe that's died out or not, whether or not it's viable in its written form. And in 1948, there were already linguists such as Maurice Swadesh who had been writing about language endangerment. But what is clear now is that globalization is bringing about the phenomenon at an unprecedented rate. The figures that are most often cited are these of Michael Krauss. Back then in 1992, he had predicted that about 90% of the world's languages may become moribund or extinct by the end of the 21st century. So moribund here means that the language is not passed on to the next generation, effectively indicating the end of a language's viability. So UNESCO provides quite similar figures, stating in 2003 that 50% of the world's languages are losing speakers, and that 90% of the world's languages may be replaced by dominant ones by the 21st century. So we have such slightly less drastic figures in our own project, the Endangered Languages Project. So based on the language data that we've collected on the most updated figures that we could find, our team at the Endangered Languages Project that's based at the University of Hawaii predicts that about 3 languages become extinct every month or so. So while this might appear less daunting than hearing that 50 to 90% of the world's languages are seriously at risk, note that over 3,000 languages have already become threatened in some way or dormant out of the 7,000 odd languages that there are in the world today. So we've got about 7,500 to 7,700 or so, depending on how you count. And half of these are already threatened or dormant. So if I use the word dormant here, it usually means that the language has lost its last speaker in the last 50 years or so, or it could also refer to a language to which we are uncertain if we have indeed lost the last speaker. So that's what dormant would usually mean. Okay, so I'd like to share with you a little bit more about what this phenomenon looks like more globally. So if you go to our project website on endangeredlanguages.com, you will see these various colored dots. So each different color represents a different level of endangerment. So this is a screen capture that I have here because I didn't want to mess up the presentation. But if you do go to the website and if you do zoom out, you'll see a lot more languages included on this map. So just to be clear, we are only interested in covering the threatened or dormant languages on this site. We aren't really interested in viable ones. So if you look at the ones in black, those ones are already dormant, meaning they've lost their speakers in the last 50 years or so. The ones in red are severely endangered, and the yellow ones represent languages that are endangered, but less severely so. So perhaps more interesting to ask, if you look at the Malay Peninsula, you'll see a number of yellow and red dots over here, and Baba Malay is one of the languages represented by a red dot over here. So if you actually have some time, you can visit our site at endangeredlanguages.com And if you click on each dot, there's actually a lot more information about the language, like how many speakers there might be, if the information is available, what kind of domains the languages are used in, and so on and so forth. So highly encourage you to check out the website if you have some time too. All right. So why then are languages threatened? I'll speak more broadly about these threats before talking more specifically about Baba Malay later on. So languages can become threatened for various types of reasons, most often for economic reasons. Oftentimes, speakers can decide that they would rather speak a more dominant language because it offers them the economic opportunities that they perceive as being unavailable to them if they were to continue speaking their less dominant language. So this might be a very highly familiar kind of scenario to us, for example. And then political factors are often also important. In some places, languages can outrightly be suppressed. And languages can also become endangered if speaker demographics are affected. So this might happen in extreme cases, for example, in war, in genocide, when natural disasters happen, and in less extreme cases, in the case of, intermarriages. So just to share, the case of a real example of an extreme case, a personal friend of mine, Carolina Aragon, works on Akansu. So this is a language that's spoken in Brazil by about 5 people or so. So once upon a time, they had thought that this entire group of people had died out because what the landowners were doing was that they were setting large tracts of forests on fire just so that they could use the land for farming purposes and so on and so forth. So essentially, some of these people died in those fires, and they had thought that this entire group of people who were speaking Akansu had died, but they discovered them in the forest in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s. And there were, I think, 6 of them then, but now there are 5. And so these are the only people in the world who speak this language called the Akansu. So it was terrible because these events do exist, but that's what it is. And sometimes, things can happen in a less tragic way in the case of intermarriages, but this still changes the demographic factors that we have, and it might affect languages in ways that are aren't as great for them. Okay, so then languages can also become extinct or endangered because of shame, because the language is not associated with social prestige, or because the language is deemed to be unsuitable for various types of purposes, for example, for business or for trade or for education and so on and so forth. All right. So as a linguist, it's usually important to let people make their own sorts of choices, such as whether or not to perhaps adopt a multilingual home policy instead of switching entirely to a dominant one. But of course, it's necessary to understand what's at risk of being lost over here. Language is a culture repository. So we have, for example, over here, Siberian Tofa. So in Siberia, this language has different and complex names for reindeers depending on life stages because the people who spoke it or the people who speak it are traditionally reindeer herders. Then, in Bolivia, we have the case of Kalawaya. So this is a language that has over 800 words that encode medicinal plants, some of which still have no equivalent names in English. So you can see we're losing a lot of knowledge if we were to lose these languages. Okay, language is also a marker of identity. So in Hawaii, people take a lot of local pride in Hawaii Creole English, even though it's not standard American. So it's kind of a language of social cohesion. Um, and language is also plays an important role in the social and psychological well-being of speakers. So a study in Canada, for example, shows a correlation between the lack of conversational skills in native Aboriginal languages and in youth suicide rates. So, and to a linguist or to anyone who cares about, or to anyone who's interested in what makes us human, languages show us the extent to which the human cognitive capacity is capable. So before the discovery of languages such as Yellow in Papua New Guinea, for example, which is a small language, people didn't think that it was possible for more than one closure to be made at any one time in the mouth when it came to producing language sounds. So if you were producing consonants, for example, and you went p, t, k, you're essentially making one closure and releasing it very quickly. So when you do p, for example, you're making one closure with your lips. So most of the languages we know have language sounds that are made that way or consonants that are made that way. But Yellow or Papua New Guinea and languages like it were very interesting and significant when they were found because they provide evidence that human language is capable of so much more. So it's kind of, if you lost any of these languages before you even knew about it, then you would never know what the human brain and the human makeup is capable of. Okay, so bear with me for a little bit more because I know you have signed up for a talk on Baba Malay and I'm going all around the world. But I'd like to, at this point, bring up a very specific type of language known as a contact language. So hopefully you begin to see its relevance. Contact languages arise from functional needs in situations of sustained contact between speakers of different languages. Different types of contact languages include pidgins, creoles, mixed languages, among others. So I won't go very far into how these things are usually classified. But Baba Malay, being learned natively, meaning it's got native speakers, and being a lot more expanded structurally and grammatically than some of these other types of contact languages would qualify it as a creole. So, and these different types of contact languages can arise from various periods of intensive contact, such as trading, from interactions on the plantations, or through intermarriages, such as in the case of Baba Malay. So usually a contact language would also include such extreme restructuring that the language is no longer mutually intelligible with its component languages. So, while a Malay speaker might be able to hazard a guess at what's being said, if they overhear perhaps two bibiks speaking in the market, they wouldn't be able to get a full gist of what's being said because it's not as mutually intelligible as we think it might be. So other kinds of examples of contact languages that you may have heard of include slightly more far-flung ones, such as Chinook jargon, which was once spoken in the Pacific Northwest in the US, in on the American continent actually, Hawaii Creole English in Hawaii, and then we've got Macau Creole, which is closely related to Kristang, which is spoken in Malaysia and Singapore, and of course at home we have Baba Malay, spoken also in Malaysia and Singapore. So here's why I've specifically brought up contact languages in a talk on Baba Malay's language endangerment. That's because as a Creole, Baba Malay falls within the category of contact languages, which has been shown to be doubly at risk of being endangered than a non-contact languages might be. So my calculations here are based on 96 contact languages. If you are interested in the findings of this paper that was published earlier this year, but you want a more general write-up of it, John Wentz from Knowable has provided a nice write-up in this article that's made its rounds on the BBC as well as on the Atlantic. So not just in the state of Malacca, but also in Singapore and in other parts of Malaysia, such as KL. But I'd like to point out basically this important line. As these languages diminish, so do the cultures that created them. So that's some food for thought. Okay. All right. So what kind of threats do contact languages such as Baba Malay face? So contact languages are mostly non-official ones. Many of them exist alongside a more standard variety. So in the case of Jamaican Creole English, for example, it exists alongside standard English. And in the case of Baba Malay, Bahasa Melayu is the official standard variety that exists alongside it. Um, Contact languages are often perceived as being a broken form of a standard variety. So here we've got a citation, we've got Frank 2007 citing a speaker of St. Lucian Creole French. So this woman was cited saying, "We don't speak a real language, we just speak broken French." And we might find some of this familiar. So relatedly, contact languages are often used in very limited domains for limited functions. So for example, even though Afrikaans, which is a Dutch-based Creole, is an official language in South Africa, it's deemed to be unsuitable as the official language of the courts. So before 2007, 2018, or 2017, the language was actually used in the courts, but then later on they decided that this was not a suitable language to be used. So it's a Creole and it's no longer used for that purpose. So it's kind of used in more limited domains than other languages such as English might be. Okay, so contact languages are often also not associated with economic possibilities. While some form of Malay contact language or variety of Malay contact variety might have existed, and was used in trading for a good number of years in the past, so much so that Chinese traders a couple of centuries ago would have had to learn some form of it and to be able to communicate. Clearly, English is taken over by the time of the British administrators, and we have had Peranakans shift quickly to English for those kinds of advantages that that English accords. Okay, so I think I've skipped a couple of slides. All right, over here. Um, so finally at page 10, we get to Baba Malay more specifically. On the Endangered Languages project, it's classified as being critically endangered. So this is based on a few different criteria that we have. We usually look at whether or not there's intergenerational transmission. This is our most important factor. If there were no intergenerational transmission at all, meaning that the language is not being passed on to the next generation completely, then you know that the language will cease to exist at some point further down the road. We are also looking at number of speakers because sometimes this is all the information you might have about a language. So number of speakers can be quite telling. Here we have an estimated 2,000 fluent speakers or so, 1,000 in Singapore, 1,000 in Malacca. And this is based on extrapolations of the numbers that were provided in studies that were presented in the 1980s. And this is also based on asking community members how many people they think there might be who still speak the language. So just in case you're wondering where those figures come from. We also base these calculations on speaker number trends, whether the numbers are increasing or decreasing rapidly. And we know in the case of Baba Malay, it's quickly losing speakers as young people don't pick it up as much as we might like. And domains of use, the language is also used in a few specific domains. It's not very much used outside the home domain, for example. So all of these factors would lead to the classification of Baba Malay as being critically endangered. All right, so we've covered reasons for the endangerment of any language, reasons for why a contact language might be doubly endangered, but we want to address more specifically Baba Malay's endangerment. So, when English medium education first became a thing in Singapore, the Peranakans were noted to be the first in the region to adopt that mode of education. So this was after some Peranakans had sent their sons to China for a Chinese medium education at that time when we didn't actually have a system in place in Singapore. So what they eventually found out was that English could be used as a language as middleman between the British administrators and the newcomers, or the Singkit, right? Many Peranakans became prosperous as a result. So this motivated more of them to embrace the English medium education. So at the same time that they were embracing the language, they were also embracing the culture and the identity. So calling themselves at one point the King's Chinese. So this you most probably might have heard of. And this is a picture of my great-grandmother and my step-great-grandfather. So you can see that he's dressed like an English gentleman. So unsurprisingly, then because they embraced the culture so much, English became a home language for many Peranakans as well. So this was one of those crucial things that has most probably led to its endangerment. So further down, we've also got to look at intermarriages. So, at one point, it was common for Peranakans to marry within the community, which is kind of ironic considering that community started its life through intermarriages. But within community marriages, like a Peranakan marrying another Peranakan is no longer the norm. So, with the natural progression of time, and the dwindling of community size, most Peranakans marry outside the Peranakan community. So with that, it means that there might be multiple languages that you might choose from for a home language. So for example, if your husband spoke Tamil as a home language like my husband does, and my home language is Peranakan, which would I choose to use dominantly with my child? So for practical reasons, for most people, it wouldn't be Peranakan. More likely than not, it would be English. So even in cases where, parents practice a one parent, one language policy, meaning one parent might speak language A to the child, a different parent might speak language B to the child. Usually the languages that are selected tend to be official ones like English and Mandarin, for example. So these all together led to Baba Malay's current state. Okay, so most of you are here because you are interested in culture and you're interested in language and you would care about the potential loss of Baba Malay. But it's good to restate for the record that every single reason to care that applies, every single reason to care about another language would also apply to Baba Malay as well. So Baba Malay provides speakers with a connection to the older generation who may not be as fluent in another language. So while rare, there are still monolingual speakers that exist. I remember Baba Peter Wee, who was the late president of the Peranakan Association Singapore. He used to visit an elderly Peranakan lady at a nursing home to talk to her, and she used to look forward to it very much because even though people would speak to her at the nursing home, they couldn't speak her language, so they could speak Malay, but they could not speak Baba Malay. So it was a source of it was her well-being. The language acted as it was her well-being, basically. And Baba Malay also acts as a marker of identity, and it's also a culture repository in itself. And to the linguist, Baba Malay is yet another piece of the human cognitive puzzle, telling us what human beings are capable of. So I'll elaborate on some of these points. So what would demonstrate Baba Malay's importance as a marker of identity? So if you walk on the streets in Singapore and if you look at everyone in their daily office wear, gym gear or casual outfits, and I'm not detracting from the importance of tangible heritage here because tangible heritage is also clearly important. But the truth of the matter is, that most Peranakans nowadays that you see wouldn't put on a sarong kebaya every single day of their lives, even though they used to, like my great-grandmother used to. So the only thing that would set aside one's identity apart from the crowd in the market or at the office would be if one spoke the language. Baba Malay is also a gateway to a repository of culture. If you use the word brooch, for example, to denote the kerosang, as you see in the middle picture over here, or if you went a step further to say a brooch that's linked by a series of chains, would it have the same effect as saying Kurosang? So let's take, for example, another example, the tokgui, the cloth that's attached to the front of altars for significant occasions for praying. So if you said altar cloth, would it evoke the same imagery as tokgui? So I would say not. It just simply doesn't have the same performative force. And if you took it a step further, you'd realize that there are so many parts of the culture that aren't as accessible. If you don't speak the language, for example, you wouldn't be able to appreciate wayang peranakan, you wouldn't be able to appreciate pantuns, for example. All right. Baba Malay is also its own testament to what the human brain is capable of. As a linguist, it's fascinating to me because it responds to complex questions, such as what happens when the grammars of two languages meet. So, long answer in short, it adopts characteristics of both languages selectively, and it's also evolved in its own unique ways. So, here's how Baba Malay has adopted the tentative aspect from Southern Min, or some people call this more locally Hokkien, one of its component languages. So you could say jalan-jalan, meaning to take a walk, meaning to not walk purposefully to some place or not walk purposefully to any place in particular, but just to, take a walk. If you went jalan-jalan, then you would have incidentally walked somewhere. Um, so the tentative aspect is actually not characteristic of Austronesian languages such as Malay. And if you see in local Malay, it's just because there's been a lot of Hokkien influence in the area. So instead, you would see the tentative aspect being used in Sinitic languages, such as in Hokkien over here. So over here with this example, "Gua bei ke kiang kiang," meaning I'm going to go take a walk. So similarly, you can see the tentative aspect being used. Why? Because Baba Malay derived its tentative aspect from Hokkien. So in a different example, over here, we have a give construction. So kasi and ho both mean give. So kasi in Baba Malay means give, Hokkien, ho means give as well. And you could say in Baba Malay, at least in the variety that's spoken in Singapore, you could say gua kasi dia tipu. So something like I gave him cheat, or I was cheated by him, basically. And some speakers in Hokkien, in Malacca, actually find this too Hokkien, so that's what they have told me in the past. So there are actually some slight differences between the variety spoken in Singapore and Malaysia, with the one in Singapore being a lot more Hokkien. So indeed, this is a for word translation of the Hokkien sentence that you see over here, "Gua hoi pian," which would basically mean the same thing. So essentially, the structure of the language comes in a large part from Hokkien, while much of the lexicon or the vocabulary comes from Malay. And then I could also answer, as a linguist, different kinds of other questions, such as those on phonology, those on language sounds, for example, or patterns in other languages. So, for example, you could ask what happens when a tone language is combined with a non-tone language, since Hokkien is tone, but Malay is non-tonal. And Baba Malay is uniquely positioned to answer this question because contact languages that combine both a tone and a non-tone language together are just simply rare. So if you're interested in what happens when a tone language meets a non-tone language, here's just a small snippet. So for items that are one syllable in length, monosyllabic, such as hu in Hokkien, meaning amulet, the tone can be dropped in Baba Malay. So in the first spectrogram on top, you can see the blue dots rise slightly to give you hu. And in the spectrogram at the bottom, in a Baba Malay sentence, pi bake hu, you can actually see the tone on hu fall. So and it's not the same as it were in Hokkien. Okay, so having covered why anyone might care about the potential loss of Baba Malay, this might be a good time to talk about the second bit of this talk. So we've talked about endangerment, now we're talking about documentation. So why is it important to document a language? Well, language endangerment at its exponential rates has created an urgent need to do so. Documentation of a language would benefit not only the linguists like myself, who might be interested in answering questions about language such as the ones that I've asked earlier, but documentation of a language can also be used for community purposes. For example, in the event that a speaker community is interested in revitalizing the language and would like some documentation of language to base their pedagogical material on. So there are various reasons for why we should document a language. And of course, we want to be able to capture what the language looks like before it's hopefully it's not gone. But if that happens, we would want a snapshot of the language, or we would want a snapshot of language before it changes too much, for example. So talking about records, there are a number of early records of the language. So documents of the language do exist. Early documents of language exist substantially in the form of Cerita Dulu Kala, so literally stories from the past. And most of these are translations of Chinese classics, although you would find exceptions as well, such as a translation of Anna Sewell's Black Beauty. That's a title, that's a Baba Malay title as well. And most of these are serialized novels published between 1880s and 1950s, although after the war, you could see it petered out a lot more. And popular authors included writers such as Baba Wan Bun Sing and Baba Chan Kim Bun. So titles that you might be familiar with might include titles such as Samkok or the Three Kingdoms, which was known because it was exceptionally long running. And then we also have Ko Jie Tian or Gao Jie Tian, or Monkey God, for example, and Si Jing Gui. So these are some of the common titles that you might have heard of before. And the Baba Malay titles were interestingly published in Singapore, but I don't actually know of any titles that were published in Malaysia at all, or Malacca at all. While the Indonesian Peranakan titles were published in Batavia or modern-day Jakarta. So if you're interested in these, the National Library has got a very good collection. So over the years, I've also donated about 99 volumes to its rare books collection. So I just want to I just want to say, if you come across one of these books or you have some of these in possession, and they are kind of falling apart because the staples have gone rusty or they're eaten by worms, it's always a good idea to pass them on to an organization who can care for them, such as the National Library, and who can kind of disseminate them to more people or could present them to more people. So, so if you're interested, the National Library has got a good collection of these books. So other texts or written records of the language also exist. In particular, there were translations of religious material. So here are just some of the titles, including the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, as well as the Pilgrim's Progress. And then there were also, in other instances, records of pantones and songs that were collected, such as this volume written by Baba Wan Bun Sing and published in Singapore in 1933. So, just like last week's talk on Shire, Peranakan pantun deal uniquely with Peranakan themes and motifs. So, for example, here are a few lines. I am not actually very fluent in Baba Malay. I've kind of learned it for academic reasons, but I'm going to try. So I'm taking it from the third stanza. Sangkit punya sanggo, singit sebelah. So the sangkit hair bun is, slanted to one side, kind of crooked. Rupa hitam manis sebagi gula kelapa. So her face is dark and sweet like coconut. So these again only make sense in the Peranakan context, with the sangkit being the mistress of ceremony in the Peranakan wedding scenario, for example. Otherwise, if you took it out of that Peranakan context, it would not make as much sense at all. Okay, so last week, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim also brought up the Bintang Timur, which was an initiative by Song Xiang. So, while the official newspaper name was Bintang Timur, Surat Kabar Sehari-hari dalam Bahasa Melayu, meaning the Eastern Star, a daily newspaper in Malay, the language featured in this newspaper was Baba Malay rather than Malay. So interestingly, it was never actually a daily, it was a weekly. And then at one point, it was published thrice a week, I think, and after which publication ceased after a year or so. Then there came Kabar Selalu, so or literally always news, or the daily newspaper. So this ran for about 5 months. But the wonderful thing about this newspaper was that it used to carry serialized stories such as Cerita Ula Putih sama Ula Hitam, um, the tale of the white snake and the black snake. So I'm not sure if you can read the words over here because they're really tiny. I just wanted to show you what the newspaper looked like. But in the second column, it actually begins by saying, bila ini cerita ular putih sama ular hitam sudah penghabisan, kita nanti kulekan lain satu cerita dinamakan Mulyang Gyok. So now that the story of the white snake and the black snake is over, we're releasing another story by name of Mulyang Gyok. So basically, serialized stories were the mainstays of the bread and butter of this newspaper. So more modern records of the language exist as well, particularly in the revival of Wayang Peranakan. So these were once popular in the earlier half of the 1900s, influenced very much by the Bangsawan scene or the Malay opera scene. But these heated out very much so until the staging of Billy Menantu in 1984 by Baba Felix Chia. Until today, every year, the Gunung Sayang Association plays an important role in expanding these records of the language by staging Wayang Peranakan that's fully written in Baba Malay. Every year, it's possible to do so, given the situation this year with COVID and everything. Okay, so in a talk about language, I think I've missed the page. Yeah. In a talk about language, books that treat language as its subject also have to be mentioned. Baba Gui Tian Hock was extremely vital in publishing Mas Sepuluh, a book of Peranakan sayings and idioms, as well as a Baba Malay dictionary, which is basically a Baba Malay to English dictionary. So if you wanted to search up a word in Baba, in Peranakan, you would be able to see it and you'd see the English clause. And other important resources that have emerged recently are those that have been prepared by Baba Kenneth Chan as part of his team's efforts at language revitalization. So the first of which that you see on the left is Mari Cakap Baba, a textbook that he prepared with Nyonya Emmeline Thompson. So last year, he also published Cerita Cerita Baba, a reader in the language. So I believe he will be saying a lot more about this talk, a lot about this next week at his talk. So, you know, that's something to look forward to. Okay, resources about the language also include academic theses and dissertations, such as the ones that I've mentioned here. So the most well-known one might be Dr. Anne Parker's dissertation from 1986. And this was actually written on the variety of Baba Malay spoken in Singapore. So she used to do her recordings at the Katong Antique House in Singapore. So this differed from Sunny Lim's work because Sunny Lim's work actually deals with Baba Malay as it was spoken in Malacca because that's where he did most of his field work. So till today, there are academic exercises being written on the language. So we have people such as Lisa Lim and Umberto and Saudo contribute to the literature as well. And last semester, my honors thesis student, Nadine Ng, wrote about the functions of punya, nya, and mia for her fourth year thesis. So she might continue to explore this for her master's. So, you know, while all of these records do exist, it's important to talk about language documentation, which is a very specific subfield of linguistics. So this subfield deals with expanding these records of languages in a sustainable, functional ways, often time including audio and video material. So the idea with language documentation is that one is creating a multi-purpose record of a language that can be used for any purpose, be it for revitalization or for analysis. So a linguist could use those records. A person with less linguistic background might be able to use those records as well. And this record would last into perpetuity if the correct methods are being used, if the correct methods, correct technology is being harnessed, for example. So thus far in my language documentation project, I've collected more than 100 hours of audio recording from Singapore and Malacca. I don't have much from Malacca, just to be clear. Most of these are actually from Singapore. So these items are archived together with selected full translated transcripts in an online archive at Kaipuleo Hone, which is a digital archive. So the commitment of such archives is that they would hold these material for as long as they can, trying to aim as much so at perpetuity. So the direct products that I then produce using this material in 2014 for my PhD was a reference grammar of the language, as well as a two-way gloss. So a Baba Malay to English glossary, as well as an English to Baba Malay glossary. So since then, my team has expanded, and I would like to acknowledge here my assistants, my student assistant Nadine Ng, as well as Gerald Chua, who is a volunteer assistant from who's an undergraduate at NTU. So they have helped with more recordings, transcription, translation kind of work. So these were some of my key language consultants in Singapore that I was very lucky to work with. I was lucky to have worked with the late Baba Peter Wee of the Katong Antique House, Baba Victor Goh of the Gunung Sayang Association, as well as Nyonya Jane Quek. So you can see in the picture with Baba Peter Wee that he had like a headset mic on and it's attached to a recorder. And he's actually narrating here a silent video that is being presented to him on the iPad. So this is what a typical language documentation session could have looked like, might look like. So I've stopped here. I've stopped collecting new material for a bit now, and I've started on a second phase of my project, which is focused on converting early records of the language into more multi-purpose, stable, usable, and functional forms. So this includes a lot of glossing and transcription, translation of Cerita Dulu Kala. So thus far, my student assistant, Nadine Ng, has built up a corpus of 65,000 words or so, featuring selected Cerita Dulu Kala, as well as fan letters that were sent to Baba Chan Kim Boon and were published in some volumes of his serialized novel. So the National Library Board was actually highlighted this to me that, you know, that there were actually fans who sent in fan letters to these writers, and you know that Chan Kim Boon had published some of these, so they were really interesting to look at. So where does that type of documentation lead to? You know, with them, we are able to do various things, such as compare these older and newer varieties of the language. So I had actually expected to find a lot more variation in the early Baba Malay data, given that the form of modern Baba Malay is a lot more fixed than what I would actually expect a Creole to be. So I actually expected there to be a lot more variation in a Creole. And indeed, you know, further back in time, there was actually a lot more variation. So here we have examples of a fan letter written to Chan Kim Boon in the 1890s, sorry, as well as a sentence from Auliat Kokchi written by Wan Bun Sing in 1931. So you can see in the first sentence how Kosu is used to mean story, and the Chinese words are used as well. And the Chinese words are used there for Kongzhu as well, for Confucius. So at this time, we knew, in fact, that Cerita was definitely used as a word to indicate story. So, but this view shows that Baba Malay speakers felt that they had a lot of options, more options, when it came to choosing the vocabulary of their choice, or when it came to saying something in their language. Then in the second example, Bonaiho over here is used to mean no alternative, which might strike one today as being extremely Hokkien. So the language is also seen to vary towards Malay in some instances. In Auliat Kokchi, Ibu is used to mean mother over here. Whereas today, we wouldn't really think of that word as being Baba Malay. So in other written works of that time, you'll also see the words mak or nyo being used as well, attesting to the amount of variability that there was in early Baba Malay. So as can be seen from from these examples. And there was also the influence of English, as can be seen from the word book being used here very blatantly in one of these fan letters that was written in 1890. So the next step for myself as a researcher would be to figure out why early Baba Malay shows so much variability. So curve continuums are natural when a language is made up of more than one language. So what this means is that a language can usually vary towards either component language, and a speaker of a Creole language can usually utilize features from either component languages to some flexible extent. So in the case of Baba Malay, a speaker could be more Hokkien or more Malay, depending on the kind of features chosen. Some of this might be subconscious, some of this might be conscious, depending in some cases on the scenario, for example. And another reason for why Baba Malay might have shown so much variability might be the fact that this language, as it was spoken then, reflected the linguistic ideologies of those times. So there were competing pressures, for example. For some, there was that draw to be the King's Chinese or the Queen's Chinese or British subjects as opposed to Sinkic or newcomers. And then for others, the nationalist movement and the reform movement in China were pretty important. So these movements kind of occurred as or developed as responses towards China having lost the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894. So the idea here was that a common language would strengthen the Chinese identity. So you can see in this line, so this was someone who wrote into the newspapers, we straight Chinese fathers should therefore encourage our girls in every possible way to give up the Malay language and revert to the Chinese tongue. So this was one of those sentiments that you might have seen. But of course, then there were people who didn't think the same way. So over here, we have the editor of the Malacca Guardian saying Malay is not a part of China. The language of this country is either English or Malay, and most of the straight-born Chinese are content to learn well those two languages. So there were those who thought it was important to speak Malay. So of course, that's all. That's all for going forwards. But in general, a comparison of both diachronic and synchronic documentation show that early Baba Malay appears to be a lot more variable in form. My sense is that much of this variability has been lost due to the endangerment of the language. And this is kind of my current research agenda. So when it comes to Baba Malay, yeah. So basically, it's a more endangered Creole, less variable in form than a less endangered Creole. And more importantly, for now, I hope that I've demonstrated how essential language documentation is when it comes to appreciating how a language is evolving. Okay. All right. And because this talk started with the talk of endangerment, it makes sense to end on the same note. So I've been asked this several times by at different panels and by the newspapers and the media if Baba Malay is doomed. I'd like to be a little bit more optimistic and a lot more hopeful. But what we do know as linguists is that whether or not a language can exist into the future or can survive in the future depends on whether or not intergenerational transmission exists. So basically, if a language is not passed on to future generations, it will cease to exist at some point. And going forth, what we have to figure out is how to encourage intergenerational transmission. So currently, we have passionate individuals such as Baba Kenneth Chan and his wife, Nonya Emmeline Thompson, who have been running language lessons in Singapore, and they have produced a lot of material, great material in the language, such as their Mari Cakap Baba textbook. And what's great is that he's continued to prepare a reader that learners can use outside of the classrooms. So, but the real question is, how do we further expand the languages domain back into the homes again? So how can the language stay relevant to the needs of the youth, for example? How do you make it cool, fun, and exciting when there's no word for Wi-Fi or for Instagram in a language like this? So of course, these questions have no easy answers, but if Baba Malay is to be viable into the future, then we might have to respond to some of these questions. Okay, so, and here are some of the references. I think I've listed all the references that I have over here. So I think I'll stop over here. Kamsia banyak-banyak. Thank you for your time. I hope this was worth your dinners. Okay, so Danielle, I am done here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Nala Lee, for your insightful talk. So it was a very good kind of overview of language endangerment in general, followed by the talk about functions of language, contact languages, and I found the aspect where you were kind of contextualizing and analyzing language evolution and endangerment in terms of historical events and nationalism quite really interesting angle, which we may not necessarily have immediately thought of. So we'll now answer the question and answer segment of the talk. But before that, we'll take a quick few minutes break so that you can compose your questions and process the talk. And so meantime, let me share the slide showing the Q&A etiquette and proceedings. Yeah, so we will convene in a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Pahlawan merdeka nan gugur sebagai bunga, harumlah mewangi atas pangkuan ibunda. Walaupun kamu telah gugur membuang nyawa, tapi nan jasamu tercantum bagai satria. Kesumanan indah, oh bunga negara, Aji Jaya Sakti pahlawan merdeka nan gugur sebagai ratna.
Okay, so let's begin the question and answer session. So we'll kind of start off perhaps with language documentation methods. So one of the more interesting questions that was upvoted by quite a few people was, could an AI be trained to learn Baba Malay either as a means of language preservation or learning? Are there projects to try to do this? What about voice, not just orthographically? So I think it's kind of looking at different ways that one can document a language.
All right, so I'll speak to that. So far, what I've tried to do is to use a forced aligner to transcribe Baba Malay. That means I'm trying to teach the computer how to identify the sounds of Baba Malay and transcribe it um, like it should sound. So, but this depends on a lot of data being available for the language. And the forced aligners that are out there are basically for standard varieties of English, not even for the local variety that we have. So it's still a ways to go. But yes, essentially, it should be possible to train AI to do something that way. Yeah, there's no reason for why it can't be done. It's just that perhaps, we need a lot more data for the language to train these machines on. Yeah.
Okay, and related to that, kind of like the um, accessibility of archives and information. So one other comment that was brought forth was why archive, these audio recordings in a specific archive that most people cannot access, and how do you then allow people to learn more or get access to such archives if they're all kind of closed up?
Yeah. So that really is for the job of the academic to tell people that these resources are available. And it is. So my archive is actually searchable online at Kaipuleo Honi. And if you register for the archive, you can actually listen and use the data. So there used to be a 5-year kind of thing where the data was made private to me, but right now anyone should be able to actually, that was 2014. So right now anyone should be able to actually download some of these sound files and listen to them. If they search Kaipuleo, Hone, Baba Malay, or if they, or you can send me an email if you want to find out more, and I'll send you the link. So the reason for why it's good to use a professional archive like this is that because they are committed to making the data stay available in perpetuity. So if we did it ourselves, what happens is that a lot of people used to do it themselves, and then they would have recordings in shoeboxes or notebooks in shoeboxes, and these would eventually um, be gone if the person who was working on these languages died, and there would be no way of accessing these records. So the standards that an archive sets, for example, they require things like good quality recording in formats that might be used in a lot of functional ways. So those are, and they might require things like metadata for the material. So you have a sense of where the material is from, who spoke it, and so on and so forth. So all of those are important types of information, and an archive kind of forces the researcher to consider all of these ones. If you're doing it yourself, it could just end up in what we call a data graveyard. So, but of course it's for the linguist or the researcher to kind of communicate this properly, that these materials do exist and they can be used for the communities in some instances. So it really depends on what the community's wishes are or what the speaker's wishes are. So yeah, so far none of my speakers have had any issues with their data being shared. So it's fine if people are interested in that. Yeah.
That's a good point in terms of like whether such initiatives could come from ground up. Maybe they could start from ground up, but eventually like having the information in archive would make it last longer. Okay, so maybe we'll go into another kind of theme that people have brought up through the question and answer, which is more of like identity and identity formation through Baba Malay as an indicator or identity marker, as you mentioned earlier. So some people, can ask like, does it, have a difference because of younger generations? They're more inclined to speaking practical languages such as English and Mandarin that allow them to have an economic advantage globally, like what you mentioned. So in your opinion, how do we, in a sense, convince youth to start embracing endangered languages like Malay, Baba Malay?
All right. So it's interesting that you brought up this different generational approach to it. So what linguists have actually observed is that usually it's the grandparents' generation that speaks the language. Then it might be the parents' generation that doesn't pass it on to the children. And then we've got what is called the third generation regret. So at the third generation, usually the children, people begin to regret not knowing the language well enough. But oftentimes, the language is so eroded in the family that they can't begin to actually, it's not that easy for them to actually access that language anymore, as it would have been in the past if their parents had insisted on speaking it to them. So this is what linguists label the third generation regret. But so it really depends on how motivated the individual is, for example, to learn the language or to go to language classes, such as Danielle herself. Because I know she attended one of these classes. So you have to ask Danielle really what made her sign up for Baba Malay class. Yeah.
Well, I guess now that I'm involved in this session, I think it was just kind of interesting for me to see how some things that are quite unthought of, like inherent, like language learning, which is something you might see as passive, especially when you grow up and just absorb from your parents, to try and approach that from a different perspective as a person who's going into a language without actually knowing like why, like how you attain that language in the first place. So yeah, that was the reason for me. So it was also kind of an academic kind of reason as well. Related to the idea of the family and parents in shaping one's type of language spoken. Sam asks if does it make a difference for intergenerational transmission if a father as opposed to a mother is a Baba Malay speaker? What about a caregiver like a nanny?
So it would make sense that the person with whom the child has most interaction with, if that person spoke the language, then we could be more assured that the child might be able to continue speaking the language fluently if this person spends the most time with that child. So it doesn't actually matter if it's father or mother or nanny. It just depends on the time involved and whether or not parents make that, or caregivers make that decision to actually try to maintain speaking the language to the child, even though it might not be easy. In my case, I'm not a fluent Baba Malay speaker at all. If I wanted to do this, then it would be very effortful. So these are things that have to be considered when deciding on the family language policy. But yes, it can be done, and it really depends on who is spending most time with the child, who is most in charge of his upbringing, for example, or for his caregiving.
Right. All right. This is related to that kind of a semi-question / reflection from Samuel, who talks about how he tried to somewhat reluctantly spoke Baba Malay to his monolingual grandmother and preferred to speak English to another grandfather, but today regrets and laments the slow embracing of the language in youth and perhaps how he may have lost part of his identity. Yeah, so it does kind of show the role of language in maintaining such identities. We have another question about how could there be any downsides to trying to prevent a language from going extinct? Do some languages have to die so that new languages and cultures can thrive?
So it depends on what these new languages and cultures that you're speaking of are. We see a huge number of languages being endangered, but we don't actually see a lot of new languages and cultures being created at that kind of same rate. So we are actually losing more than we are gaining. In terms of diversity, to the linguists, or to anyone interested in biodiversity or culture diversity or ethnodiversity, more diversity makes the ecosystem a lot stronger. So that's what we are looking at. But at the same time, there are, of course, caveats when you do things like this. For example, I can't go up to the speaker and say, you should be speaking language X or you should be speaking your home language, when perhaps it's language Y that offers this person, economic opportunities. There's no way of yeah, you just can't do that. So it's for speakers to make their own choices. But at the same time, that if they don't embrace English, for example, that they cannot become part of this global economy if that's their wish to be part of that global economy. So so that's on the individual basis, and on a more macro basis, as a linguist or as someone interested in diversity, the more the merrier. Yeah, and we haven't actually seen languages being found or new languages emerge at the expense of these other languages that do die out. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for answering that question and also for the question. So in relation to that, Bang Ting asks if there is a word or a concept that exists in Baba Malay but does not exist in either Malay nor Hokkien.
I can't answer that offhand right now, but I'm pretty sure there is. If anyone wants to, chime in and say something about this, feel free to. Yeah, but there are definitely words that exist that don't exist in either Malay or in Hokkien, or concepts that exist in either. Oh, so for example, words that exist in Baba Malay, but uh, let's see. Okay, for example, kuping for ear is not a word that's used in Malay because in Malay we use telinga, and in Hokkien it's something else that is not kuping as well. Sorry, I don't know what the Hokkien term is for it. So there are words that exist uniquely in Baba Malay. So this one is actually Portuguese influence, but there are words that exist in Baba Malay that don't actually exist in their main component languages.
Yeah, that point that you brought up does bring to mind. I think telinga and kuping are also different influences from like Indonesian Malay or Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Melayu. So that would also then contribute to the different types of vocabularies that come into the language. We'll move on to the next question, which is that is there any difference between a naturally endangered language, such as where speakers end up not passing it on for different reasons, as you mentioned, versus one that is politically endangered, like if a government forbids a person to learn a language? So what do like linguistic scholars
We would say that,
what view do they have of this?
yeah, we would usually say that there are no natural reasons for why this might occur, because at the end of the day, this is a language choice, or it's a choice, or it's a decision that people make, whether or not to pass on the language. Even if you, for example, in the case of intermarriages, a decision is made, not necessarily just for political reasons. So oftentimes the reasons to give up one's language, as another linguist once said, it's seldom voluntary, and it's a decision that the person has made, and very oftentimes it's seldom voluntary. Yeah.
Okay. So in relation to the idea of like voluntary, not voluntary, Evinuru then asks, how do people's attitudes about Baba Malay, what are they like currently? And do you think that it may significantly shape the intergenerational transmission of the language?
So what I've seen or what I've observed is that people who are very interested in kind of revitalizing the language, or people who are interested in language, are not necessarily the younger speakers, not necessarily those of school-going age. So, when people like Danielle joins like a Baba Malay language class, everyone is it's very happy, because that means there's young blood interested in language. But unfortunately, people are enthusiastic about it, but it tends to be the older people who are enthusiastic about it, those age 40 and above, even 50s and above. Very seldom the young people. So yes, in general, if you ask people, they would say, "Oh yes, we would love to bring the language back. We would love to be able to speak the language." But if you go to the language classes and you observed who were the ones like signing up for these classes, you'd see that they would be people with some interest in language. Some of them would be interested because of their jobs, because they're museum curators or docents, and others would be interested because they used to speak the language at home, but they no longer can do so anymore. Rarely we have younger people. So that's the realistic situation. But if you went around and you ask younger generations, they would say, oh yes, of course we wouldn't mind learning, but whether or not they actually go to class, they learn and they bring it home with them, it's another story or another question altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation because, when I was also observing these classes, there was quite a big proportion of people who were learning it who were of the older generation. And a lot of it was also based on perhaps what you mentioned, that third generation regret, where they may have heard of it in their youth, but eventually did not use it. Perhaps it was also because that time of nationalism and the slow move towards like English could have caused that. And we'll now, see this comment from Ernest, who was referring to Baba William Gui, who raised the observation that for Baba Malay in the younger generations, it changed, like the language itself changed as compared to the Baba Malay of earlier generations. So one of the differences he observed is the inclusion of more English words. What do you think about the mismatch in the current Baba Malay courses and slightly different variety spoken within the community?
So, well, the problem or the thing is that when you do teach a language, there must be a form that you have selected to teach. So it's not an easy decision which form to teach, but it's necessary because you can't be teaching a spectrum. It's quite difficult to say, let's teach a spectrum of it. Let's teach how the old people do it, the young people do it, and so on and so forth. So there certainly will be a mismatch, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because then if you do speak the language or if you're learning the language, then you can, like Ernest is doing, become more observant about what's going on, and then you decide, oh, this is actually, and you figure out for yourselves some sociolinguistic information, such as this is the kind of language that the older people are using, this is the kind of language that the younger people are using. At the same time, it's also important to not be too prescriptive about things, because that can really deter the younger generation from learning. So I speak from personal experience. Long time ago, when I started interviewing people, there are lots of people who told me that my Baba Malay was too Malay, or that it was very coarse, that I wasn't using saya, I was using gua. And this older Peranakan gentleman, who shan't be named, said that it was very rude for me to use gua because I'm female. So in his time, then females would be a lot more dainty, a lot more halus, and then they'd use saya instead of gua. So so this was all right to me as a language researcher, but as someone who's interested in language, I wouldn't give up for these reasons. But you can see how some of the younger people might not want such a prescriptive approach to learning a language. But of course, when it comes to running a language class, you have to kind of choose a version to teach. So that's a necessary kind of outcome.
Continuing along that line, when we're talking about different forms of the same language, how then would you classify that in terms of your language documentation work? Like, would there be different forms that are then grouped under the same main kind of segment, or?
Well, we try to, as far as I could, in my reference grammar that I wrote based on this information that I had, I included variations as well, where variations were a thing. So I said, well, this is most of what we got, but there was also person X who said that you could say it this way. So in terms is as far as allowing for variation, that's how I've acknowledged it. But it's true, if you look at a lot of these recordings, a lot of them are, there's inevitably a lot of English in a lot of these recordings that I've made, and influence from other languages like Hokkien as well. Yeah.
So as for the general state of Baba Malay, are there any official updated statistics on Baba Malay speakers in the region, as well as perhaps transmission in the Peranakan diaspora, like in the UK or Australia?
Not that I know of, but that would actually be really interesting to study. So, what's happened with the diasporic community, in effect, and there hasn't actually been official census of who speaks Baba Malay for a very long time now. You could look at, the early British administration period. That was a time when people still kind of collected who spoke a different variety of Malay, and Baba Malay would fall under it. But right now, it's been a long time, and no one's actually collected official information. So the kinds of numbers that I have are extrapolations from the 1980s, and from just generally asking people, who else do you know who speaks the language? Who else do you know who speaks the language? And then you can kind of gain a figure from there. But of course, these are estimates. And of course, then I would encourage you or anyone else who is interested to pursue um, the question of how many speakers actually speak it in the diasporic community. So those would be really interesting to find out. Yeah.
When you mentioned earlier on about the newspapers and the ability and literacy rates of the Babas and Nyonyas. So for that, how common would it be for Baba or Nyonya to have publications or collections of cerita dulu kala based on kind of language that they spoke? Would it be common? Like, was it kind of entertainment for them to read these books, or?
Yeah, so this is a personal story. So my mom is not Peranakan, but my father is. So, and she was always very amazed by my grandfather, who did not speak a word of Mandarin. He spoke Baba Malay, spoke English, but he never spoke Mandarin. And he knew all these old stories. He knew all these this Samkok story and Si Jing Kui and so on and so forth, and and the water margins, and she was always very curious about how he did it. So basically what he did was to read these stories. These were the serialized novels that he had, so they did do it for entertainment. It was their pastime. So sadly, a lot of these books have been thrown out, so no one knows the value of these things that they're throwing out. We had a huge cupboard of them, but my uncle decided to get rid of them because no one was reading them, so to rebuild my collection. But it's a very common story, and it was indeed used for entertainment in the past by various many speakers. And you can see it simply happen, or you can see how popular it is simply by the fact that some of these people had fans who wrote them letters, which is pretty amazing and very cool for that time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would also be addressed in next week's talk with Kenneth Chan, because he would probably share a bit about his research on the Cerita Dulu Kala as well. Yeah, so I guess in relation to language documentation today, how can people play a part or help out in either maintaining, documenting endangered languages?
I guess you can always be part of small projects, and you can actually record, if you're interested, you can always record like the people you're interacting with, your older community, your older family members, if they're around. It was something that I used to do even before I started my PhD. That I would talk to people and say, hey, can I record your language, because I'm interested in language, and I'll get my great grand uncle to speak to me that way, or whoever it was left who could still speak the language. So you start from small steps, but learning about linguistics can also help. So and yeah, those things, I guess, just trying to really talk to the older people in the language, and maintain it at home goes a long way. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. So I think trying to also look at Baba Malay as early on in this series, Dr. Phyllis Chu was mentioning, comparing the parallels between Baba Malay as well as Singlish today. So this is kind of related to one of the questions that were asked about, do you think the Creole that arises out of further marriages or intermarriages within different communities would be of a similar flavor to Baba Malay or Singlish for that matter?
I guess it depends on how big that certain community is, because then it's not just that the language emerged out of nowhere, because it actually emerged in accompaniment with a specific community with its own specific cultural practices. So, and then you, of course, had to be able to speak about those cultural practices that you shared as a community. So it was just different groups of people intermarrying, but they didn't, there wasn't a shared culture as much. I wouldn't expect a Creole to emerge in the same way. Yeah, usually it's also part of identity. So do these people identify as the same kind of community, for example? But also Creoles usually exist because just simply because these people who had to get married together at that point did not share a language in common. So they had to create a language for communication. So most of these days, like with the intermarriages that go on, that happen, you can actually most probably speak another language in common with your spouse, such as English. So there would be very little reason to create a language that you didn't have to create.
Okay, so yeah, that answers this question. Yeah, thank you for asking this question. Thank you, Dr. Lee, for answering this. I think this is all the time that we have left for this session, this talk. So thank you again, Dr. Lee, for giving this talk and answering these questions, having this discussion. And big thanks to our audience as well for joining us this evening. So I'll just pull up again the slides where we have our regular visiting hours if you would like to come by the Baba House, and our visits can be arranged through pre-bookings on PTIX. And we have one more talk to round off this series next week, where this exploration of language is brought into the contemporary literary sphere, and also continues the conversation that was started by Nala, as well as perhaps wrapping up the series that of different perspectives that were given. So do catch the author Kenneth Chan's sharing on his research on the Cerita Dulu Kala next week, and his work in replicating this genre, interpreting this genre in today's context. So finally, please leave your feedback through this QR code that is displayed here. We will also send a link through the chat. And this is all from us today. Thank you for participating in this conversation, for the many questions that you asked. Yeah, it was very interesting to read all of them. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you.